Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
Hi, my name is Mark Morton, and I'm the author of a new young adult novel called The Headmasters. It's a dystopian novel, and it's set in Northern Ontario. I'm from Canada. I live in Canada. And this novel is about creatures that attach themselves to your back, and they can control your mind, more or less, for about 18 hours per day. I mean, there's a lot more plot around it than that, but that's the basic premise or challenge that is facing this community of people, that they have these things attached to their back. What makes it really, really difficult is the fact that the headmasters can sense your thoughts. So if you even think about trying to get rid of it, it will kill you. It'll inject this kind of toxin into you. The headmasters, I'll tell you what they look like. I actually grew up in another part of Canada, Saskatchewan, part of the prairies, the plains. And one of the things that I hated there were wood ticks, the things that attach to you or your dog, and then they suck your blood and swell up. I just hate them. And so I thought, if I'm going to have an alien creature, what's the most horrible thing I can make it look like? And I thought wood ticks. So I imagined the headmasters to be like plate-size wood ticks that attach themselves to you. And the main character, her name is Maple, and her challenge is to get rid of the headmasters, despite all the difficulties that I was mentioning. But she does have one advantage, which is that she starts to get the memories of someone else through her headmaster. I won't say anymore because that'll spoil it. Maybe I'll read a little bit as well. This is about a third of the way through the novel, I guess. And Maple has a sister named Lark, an older sister. And Lark has been pulled into this kind of cult that exists within the community. So they all have headmasters on them. This cult, they call themselves the Thankfuls, because they like having headmasters attached to them, because then they don't have to make any choices. The headmasters tell them to do everything. And so her sister Lark has joined this community, and Maple doesn't like that. And they meet up on the top of a building and they sort of do their stuff up there. So Maple has just climbed up to the floor where they are. I climbed up to the fourth floor of the cube, opened the door, and peeked in. I saw them in the dim light, the Thankfuls, standing in a tight circle. They faced inward, their arms draped over the shoulders of those on either side of them. They were quietly murmuring something, but I couldn't make it out. The room was large and empty, and the echo blurred their overlapping voices. Through the gloom, I could see Lark on the far side of the circle, leaning forward with her head bent low. Like the others, she had a strip of black mylar tied around her forehead. I was working up the courage to call out to her when one of them left the circle and walked toward me. It was Ivy. Ivy's their leader, and she's encountered Maple before. "Here we are, Maple," she said through the crack in the door. She was smiling, but her eyes were grim. "I know you have questions." I didn't have questions. I had accusations. "Let me answer them for you," she continued. I felt like ramming the door open and shoving her to the floor. "Answer this," I imagined, snarling, but I didn't. I slowly opened the door and let her into the stairway. As she slipped past me, the other Thankfuls began to step sideways in unison, their circle beginning a slow rotation. Their murmuring grew louder. "Please sit," Ivy said, pointing to the top step of the stairwell. I sat down, and she did the same beside me. She was closer than I wanted, so I edged toward the wall. "Why did you take her?" I spat. I fought back tears. I didn't want her to see me cry. "We didn't take her, Maple. She found us. She found our better way of being." "Shuffling in the dark with a bunch of croaking magpies," I said, my words dripping with sarcasm. "You think what we're doing is pernicious, Maple. Did you hear what we were chanting when you were spying?" "I wasn't spying." Did you hear us when you were staring at us without permission as we said our private and sacred invocations? I shook my head angrily. Sacred. I could feel the weight of that word in Zara's memories. Would you want me to spy on your grandfather and his followers when they undertake their practice of meditation in the forest? She asked. I shook my head again. I felt the stirrings of shame beginning to displace my anger. Then we're not so different, are we? Her voice was low and even, her measured words almost comforting. She reached out and gently put her hand on my shoulder. I don't know why, but I didn't push it away. Through the fabric of my shirt, I could feel the moist heat of her palm. That's right, she breathed. You see, my child, your mind has been chaotic. Your heart has been angry since the day you were harvested. But it doesn't have to be that way. Your mother died of blood loss as you were born. You were cut from her belly as she took her last breaths. And yet, her loss does not now cloud your thoughts. Her death does not breed anger or sorrow in your heart. I was just a baby, I replied, surprised she was talking about the past. I don't remember her. That's right, she murmured. To you, it is as if she never was. What a blessing. Can you imagine how wonderful you would feel if all your hopes and expectations, all your pent-up desires were as dead as your mother? The people on the other side of that door, hear their chants? Hear their chants? They have no hopes, no expectations, no desires but one, that our headmasters extend, expand, and deepen their loving grip on us, their mastery of us. When that happens, and it will happen, Maple, in good time, we will all become our destiny. We will be beautiful and constant vessels for the creatures providentially sent to us long ago, when your grandfather had scarcely entered manhood. That will be our final incarnation. We will no longer be afflicted with selfish desires and confusing choices that are resurrected every evening when our headmasters give us over to the slackenings, because there will be no more slackenings. Already, Maple, we have moved closer to our soul desire. The slackenings are becoming shorter. That is because of our service to our headmasters, our daily invocations to our lords. It has made them stronger, more efficient, less needful of slackening time to consolidate and share the disjointed sensory input they accumulate through our primitive perceptions during our grips. I nodded weakly to Ivy. While she'd been speaking, my eyes had become heavy, the stairwell hot and stuffy. I realized my head was resting on her shoulder. She smelled like wood smoke and moss. Come with me, Maple, into our invocation chamber. The windows are open and you'll feel a nice breeze. Had she said that to me, or had I imagined it? Now I was in the room. The circle of thankfuls stopped moving and chanting as they turned their faces toward me. In unison, they smiled, huge, warm, welcoming smiles that made their eyes crinkle and shine in the red-lighted dusk. Then they all raised one hand and wordlessly beckoned me to join them, to join the circle. All but one, Lark. She had dropped her hands to her sides, where they continued to hang motionless. Our eyes locked across the room, and I saw her shake her head, so slightly it was barely perceptible.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm thrilled you guys are joining us this evening. Thank you so much for being part of this new season, an amazing celebration. We have new authors and new books. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed that reading as much as I did. Before we get started, if you're new to the podcast, make sure to subscribe. You don't want to miss a single episode. We have new books and new authors coming every Monday night, so make sure to follow us. If you have following us already, give us a like, give us a review, share this with somebody. We're always better when we're growing together. So let's jump in back to our author. Hello, Mr. Mark. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing really well. Thank you.
I am so excited you're here. That was a lovely and creepy reading all at once.
That's what I wanted. That's what I was aiming for.
Mission accomplished. And by the way, your descriptions of ticks, I'm like, oh God, couldn't you have picked something else? So yes, completely got under my skin. I have phobias for bugs. Thanks. I'm going to be traumatized all day just envisioning this. So let's get started. Where did this idea come from and why is dystopia YA? Like, I want to know.
Yeah, well, there's sort of two ideas behind the conception of the novel. One is the wood ticks that I was mentioning. The other is I wanted to create a situation in which the people and the protagonist felt like it was impossible to escape. Because if the headmasters even sense you thinking about trying to get rid of them, they kill you. So how can you possibly defeat somebody who has that kind of power over you? And I think what made me want to pursue that a bit was the fact that in our world as a whole, as the globe, and in North America, in the United States and Canada, where I am, there are people who are in situations, entire communities who are in situations that they experience as hopeless. People who are in inner cities, people in Kentucky where the coal mines used to be and now they've stopped, and there's so much prevalence of drugs. Indigenous communities in Canada where they have been oppressed. And people in those situations, I think, can get to the point where they feel like it's absolutely hopeless. I can't get out of this. And it just continues generation after generation. So that's the kind of idea behind the Headmasters. I wanted to create a situation that was kind of like that. It's not an allegory of those situations, but it is a book in which somebody is facing an impossible situation. And the question is, can they get out of it?
It is such a huge moral dilemma, and at the same time, life-threatening. What do we do? How do we get out? I like the fact that you brought in there's a group of the converted that they believe
Yeah.
this is there for their good.
Yeah, which I think, can often happen. I mean, if a person gets desperate enough, they will create a cult, join a cult, do all kinds of things that are self-destructive. But when you put people into extreme circumstances, and that's why I like dystopias and post-apocalyptic fiction, it really brings out character. It can bring out leadership in people who maybe don't think that they are leaders. It can bring out terrible behavior in people who don't know that they would be capable of that.
The fact that you're bringing all these little pieces, and then you made a YA. Why a YA story? Why not just straight dystopian?
Yeah, well, okay, there's a bit of a story behind that. About 20 years ago, I had written 4 nonfiction books. They were about language and culture for the most part. One was about history. And then my wife and I adopted 4 older children. Children who are adopted at an older age, they inevitably have trauma. They have been apprehended from their parents for some sort of reason. And so it just became our lives for about 15 years to devote ourselves to those kids. My wife is a writer too. She and I both had to stop writing for those 15 years because, well, we were focused on were the kids. And when they went to sleep, that's when we fell down as well because we were just so exhausted. But after about 15 years, they got older, they became young adults, and for the most part, they're much more independent. Crises always happen, of course, with kids. And so I thought, okay, I've got time to write again, but I didn't want to write nonfiction, partly because a person gets older and the mind just cannot work the same way. I don't mean it worse, but I just couldn't contain my mind and my head anymore. Vast amounts of information that I needed to write those kinds of nonfiction books. But I still had my imagination. And in fact, I think my imagination maybe was even better because over the years, we had read so many young adult books to our kids. And so I thought, okay, I love dystopian literature, and I've really enjoyed reading young adult books. And so why don't I try it? So that's what I did. I said, okay, I'm going to write a young adult dystopian novel. And yeah, that's where it began.
The fact that you have pulled from so many different pieces to bring this together. And I love the fact that you picked books you enjoyed. You
Yeah.
have read them, you got used to them. Why not play the genre? With that, is this a standalone or is this part of the series? What have you decided to do?
Well, I'm not sure yet. I wrote it in such a way that there are some little hooks or clues that a sequel could grab onto. I really like the dystopian world that it exists in, because what happened, what caused the catastrophe was some scientific thing, doesn't matter what it was, but everybody in the world, except for the people in this little community, something happens where all their words become dislocated. So nobody can talk to each other anymore. Your word for shoe maybe is now however, and my word for shoe is now coffee. So nobody can understand each other. And so society, civilization just collapses. It's kind of like the Tower of Babel thing. So I like that idea of that kind of world because I like language. I like thinking about how we need language, things like that. And so, yeah, like I say, there are some hooks in there. So I could write a sequel, but I haven't started yet because the book was just released. And I didn't think it was a good idea to start writing a sequel until the first book was published. I have written another book, but it's not connected to this one, really. It's called The Changelings. It's not a young adult book either. How would you say, it's more literary fiction. There are some brutal scenes in it that probably wouldn't be appropriate for at least the younger end of young adult.
How do you switch back and forth between one genre and the other?
Well, I don't think I'm going to write nonfiction now, except maybe I'll write some essays from time to time. But yeah, I don't think I'm going to go right back to writing nonfiction. I see the nonfiction books that I've written as a certain phase of my life. And now I'm in a new phase. So yeah, nonfiction just doesn't pull me. And if you're not pulled to something, I mean, writing a book is hard, exhausting. And unless you're really, really pulled into it, it's going to be a slog.
It makes for very painful hours staring at a computer.
It makes it like having to do dishes instead of, I don't know, going for a walk through a nice forest.
That's a good way of looking at it. I was thinking instead of having to eat the meal, it's having to clean it. So yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned your wife is also a writer. Do you guys share stories back and forth, or she has her space, you have your space? How does that work?
Yeah, my wife, her name is Melanie Cameron, and she is a poet. She's published 2 books of poetry, again, before we adopted those children. And she's just like me. She's just recently getting back into writing. The challenge for her is she had all of these manuscripts, all these drafts of poems. And after 15 years, you obviously kind of lose track of how they were coherent. And so she's going through them now and trying to put them together. So we have very different minds in that regard, especially when I was writing nonfiction and she was writing poetry, it was like opposite ends of the spectrum. But we would still read each other's work because it's good to get a very, very different perspective. Now that I'm writing fiction, I think we've moved a little more closely. And she has read all of my stuff and she gives really, really good feedback, not just on my novels, but last night I was trying to craft a cover letter to send to an agent. And she gave me some really, really good feedback on how to get that hook, 1-sentence hook. And I also read 3 poems that she just submitted yesterday to a literary journal. I think I gave her some good feedback. So it works. We still have very different minds, but it's often a collaboration.
I enjoy the fact that you guys use each other's skills and talents to the best of their abilities without trying to change each other, which is very, very unique.
Yeah. I mean, those same qualities outside of a literary context can sometimes lead to friction. But what married couple doesn't encounter that?
Completely understand. You are so on point. You mentioned you have other books. Have you started plotting your next book, or are you still trying just to enjoy the release of this one? What are you working on now?
Well, as I was saying, I've written a second one. I haven't started sending it out yet. I'm going to very, very soon. That's the Changelings one. But I also started writing another one. This one, too, is different. This one it's not exactly a historical novel because, well, let me back up a bit. It's kind of a historical novel because it takes place in France at the end of the First World War, 1918, 1920. It also takes place in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, in Canada. Winnipeg is in the very center, literally the very center of the continent of North America. So a lot of historical detail in it, but at the same time, there's a golem in it, one of those creatures that are created out of mud in European folklore. That's what I'm working on right now. I'm about a third of the way through. I'm pulling in a lot of characters, like my 1920s are my favorite decade history. So I'm pulling in characters like Harry Houdini, who else? The sinking of the Titanic, of course. It's a lot of fun. Actually, I never thought of it now. Maybe that's kind of drawing upon the same aspects of my mind as the nonfiction that I used to write. So maybe those 2 things are coming together in this book. That never really occurred to me.
You get to play with things that you enjoy without the high expectations of having to do the research to make it a nonfiction. Here's the amount of literature that you have to research and scholarly articles, but very fun, pulling and playing with historical fiction while still keeping it very much yours.
Yeah, I subscribe to something called newspaperarchive.com or something like that. It gives you access to pretty much every newspaper that ever existed in North America, going back, well, some of them, the New York Times, going back a couple hundred years. And so I will open a newspaper from 1919, let's say, and just read through it. And you get such a sense of what the world was like then, much more of a real sense, looking at the advertisements and things like that, and the little funny things that they use to fill gaps in the columns of text. I think you get a much more real sense of history when you do that, as opposed to reading from a history textbook.
That's such a great way of looking at it. And I never thought about it. You are so right, because it is a glimpse of time. And back in the day, the newspapers were much more focused on facts and less biased to some extent.
Yeah.
So you get that essence of what was happening in the country and the world without the color commentating, give or take.
Yeah. It's also, for the most part, very heartening to see how some attitudes have changed. So that gives me hope when I look around what's happening in the world, whether it's global conflict or conflict between nations or AI, that kind of concerns me. A person can get kind of down. But then when you look back at those old newspapers, and you can see that there were some attitudes that nobody would accept now. And so there has been progress, at least some sort of moral progress, I think.
Everything evolves. I want to think about our lives as a staircase, but we're a little spiral and it just slowly goes up. So it's always exciting.
Yeah. I think sometimes it's like snakes and ladders, though. You go up and then you come back down.
It's a good way of putting it, too. I like that. Mr. Mark, tell us, what advice would you give an up-and-coming author?
Well, to be a successful author, you need three things. One is you have to have some kind of writing talent, and that's a wide spectrum. You can write like Stephen King is an extremely talented author. I wouldn't say he's a stylist, but he's a really, really good storyteller. And then you've got on the other end maybe Cormac McCarthy, whose sentences are just beautiful. I admire them so much. So you've got to have some sort of talent. You also have to have another ability, which I call sitting on your butt. In other words, you have to sit in front of your computer or your notebook, and you have to either write or you have to sit there until you do start to write. And you don't get to check your email or your text. You sit there, sit and sit and sit until you start to write. You have to find time to do that as much as possible. Every day maybe isn't possible. And then the third thing that you need to be a successful writer is good luck, because there are so many really, really talented and really determined writers out there who don't get published or don't get well known just because they haven't encountered, some sort of good luck. They haven't run into the right agent or something like that. So yeah, I think those are the three things that you need. Only two of them can you control. The other one, good luck, you can hope for.
I will have to say number 2 is my favorite, because I'm like, yeah, that is actually a skill to sit there and sit there some more. So I appreciate that. That's such a great advice. So tell us, Mr. Mark, where can our listeners find you? Where they can learn more about you and your books?
Well, if they want to see more about myself and my previous publications, my nonfiction publications, if they go to markmorton.ca, CA because I'm in Canada, so just markmorton.ca, that will take you to my own page. If they're interested in buying the Headmasters, you can get it from anywhere. Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, your local bookstore will order it. I mean, nowadays you can pretty much get any book from anywhere. Or if you want, you can go to the webpage of the publisher, shadowpawpress.com, and you can order it direct from there as well. And you can see other authors that publisher has put out as well.
So good. Listeners, go ahead and check out the book. Check out Mr. Mark's website. You might really enjoy some of the nonfictions as well. So, dear, are you ready for the lightning round?
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Super easy. Don't think too hard on these. Let's go. Soda or juice?
Soda. Up here, we call it pop.
Oh, that's good to know.
Soda is like 19th century up here.
Sweet or sour?
Sour.
Desert or ocean?
Oh, ocean, water. I love water, oceans, rivers. Yeah.
Nice. Desktop or laptop?
Laptop, because I have to be able to go around to where I feel like writing.
Okay. So here's a little different. If your main character had a theme song, what would it be?
Oh, that would be the song River by Joni Mitchell. Again, another Canadian. That's not why I chose it. It's a beautiful song. She wrote it probably close to 50 years ago. But because it's about a river and it's kind of about memory, and my book, The Headmasters, is about memory. Yeah, that would be the one for sure. No question.
Love it. Mr. Mark, it has been a pleasure having you on the show. Do you have any closing remarks?
Well, just if people who are writing, keep writing. Everybody has a story that they can tell that is in them. Sometimes if it doesn't feel like you can, or things are just in the way, just trust that you'll find your way. That's all.
I love it. Listeners, go ahead and check out Mr. Mark. Check out this book. You don't want to miss out. We'll be back next week with another amazing author. So make sure to subscribe. You don't want to miss out. And thank you, everyone. Bye.